The Coyotes came down off the ridge 3 nights running that October, and on the fourth night, Walt woke to a sound he'd heard maybe a dozen times in 11 years and never once gotten used to. Duke's bark gone from its ordinary evening rhythm into something lower, harder, continuous. The sound of a dog standing his ground rather than simply announcing something in the dark. Walt was out of bed and into his boots before he was fully awake, the way a man's body learns to move after enough years of exactly this kind of night. Coleman County, Texas, west of the little town of Talpa, where Walt Pruitt had run sheep and a smaller herd of goats on 60 acres for going on 30 years, the last 4 of them alone since his wife Carol passed. He was 66 that October, still capable, still up before light every morning without an alarm clock, but slower now than he liked to admit, and increasingly aware, in ways he mostly kept to himself, of exactly how much of the operation's actual safety rested on 4 legs instead of 2. Duke was a Great Pyrenees, 11 years old that fall, white-coated, gone slightly yellowed with age, a big dog even by his own breed's standards, north of 120 pounds in his prime, and still close to that even now, though Walt had started noticing, this past year, the particular stiffness in Duke's hips on cold mornings, the half-second longer it took him to get up from a lying position that it used to. Walt had raised Duke from an 8-week-old pup, the same spring he and Carol had first expanded from a small hobby flock into something closer to a real working operation. And from nearly the beginning, Duke had done something Walt hadn't specifically trained him for and had never quite managed to explain to anyone who asked. Every evening, without fail, as the lights started going gold and low over the west pasture, Duke would circle wide around whichever sheep and goats were still out grazing and simply begin walking them, unhurried, steady, back toward the night pen. Not herding exactly. Not the tight, driving work of a border collie, but something closer to a calm physical suggestion that the day's grazing was done and it was time to come in. "He is not supposed to do that," a visiting extension agent had told Walt once, years back, genuinely puzzled by it. "Pyrenees guard, they don't herd. That's not what the breed's bred for." Nobody told Duke that, Walt had said, and left it there, because it was true. And because he'd long since stopped trying to explain a thing his own dog simply did, night after night, without anybody asking him to. If you've ever had an animal in your life who did more for you than you ever trained them to, simply because they decided, in their own way, that it needed doing, I'd genuinely love to hear about it in the comments. I read every single one, and I'd love to know where you're watching from, too. Now let's get into Duke's story and what one hard October taught Walt about exactly how much he'd been leaning on a dog who was quietly running out of the years he had left to lean on. Carol had been the one who'd wanted the dog in the first place, back when Duke was still just an idea, the 2 of them standing in the kitchen with a breeder's phone number written on a scrap of paper. Carol saying, plain as anything, that a flock this size needed more protecting than 2 people alone could manage forever, and that she'd rather bring the help in now while they had the time to raise it right than wait until they needed it desperately and had no time left to train anything properly. She'd named the breed before she'd ever met the dog, reading about Great Pyrenees in some old agricultural pamphlet, and had been the one, that first spring, who'd sat up with the 8-week-old pup through 2 rough nights of him crying for his litter. Patient in a way Walt himself hadn't fully had the temperament for back then. Still young enough in his own working years to think patience was something you spent on livestock, not on a puppy who'd eventually just figure it out on his own. "You don't rush a thing like this, Walt," Carol had told him that second night. Duke curled against her leg on the kitchen floor at 2 in the morning. "This dog's going to be out there protecting everything we've got, for years, longer than either one of us might expect. Might as well start him off knowing somebody was patient with him once before he ever had to be strong for anybody else." Walt hadn't fully understood, back then, what she meant by it. He understood it better now, 4 years into being the only one left in that kitchen at 2 in the morning, and understood it still better watching an 11-year-old dog's hips fail him one difficult night at a time. Carol had died on a Tuesday in March, 4 years back now. Quick the way some deaths are quick, and cruel the way all of them are regardless. A stroke, no long illness to prepare for. No chance for either of them to say the things people mean to say and always assume they'll have more time to get around to saying properly. Walt had found her in the garden, and Duke, 6 years old that spring, had been the one standing over her when Walt came running. Not barking, not agitated, just standing close and still. The same patient presence he'd give any animal in his care that needed watching over and couldn't be moved yet. Walt had never told anyone, not even Ellen, what it had done to him those first months, coming in from evening chores to a house with only a dog in it instead of a wife. Duke waiting by the door every single evening with the same unhurried loyalty he'd always shown, as though he understood, in whatever way a dog understands anything, that somebody in that house needed watching over now too, not just the flock. What Walt hadn't fully let himself examine, not in 4 years, was the particular shape of the fear that had been building in him ever since. Not simply the fear of losing Duke, real and immediate as that was, but something underneath it, older and less easy to name. He had watched Carol go quick, with no warning at all, no chance to prepare, no chance to say what needed saying. And some part of him, he was slowly coming to understand that October, had spent 4 years quietly promising himself that whatever else happened to him, he would not let that same thing happen twice. Would not let something he loved slip away from him unprepared and unwarned a second time. Not if there was any way at all to see it coming first and do right by it before it was too late. Duke's slowing hips that October were the first real warning he'd been given in 4 years. He intended to actually listen to it this time. Duke's actual guarding work, the part that mattered most and showed itself least often, happened almost entirely after the pen work was done and the light had gone from gold to gray to full dark. He slept out with the flock rather than in the barn, curled near the fence line most nights, ears working even in sleep. And Walt had learned over 11 years to read Duke's different sounds the way another man might read weather. A low, occasional woof that meant nothing more than a passing deer or a barn owl too close for Duke's liking. A sharper, more sustained bark that meant something was actually testing the fence line. And, rarest of all, the sound Walt had heard that October night. Continuous, low, deliberate. Duke standing his full height at the fence rather than pacing it, holding a line rather than simply announcing a threat. Walt grabbed the shotgun from beside the back door. More habit than real expectation of needing it, since in 11 years he'd fired it exactly twice, both times into open air, both times enough, and went out into the cold, working his flashlight beam along the fence line towards where Duke's bark was coming from. He found Duke exactly where the sound placed him, planted at the northeast corner of the pen, body angled low and forward, hackles up the full length of his spine, staring out past the fence into the mesquite beyond where the flashlight beam finally caught 2 pairs of eyes reflecting back, low to the ground, moving. Coyotes, 2 of them, working the fence line the way coyotes did in a hard year, testing for a gap, a weak spot, anywhere the barrier gave. Walt didn't fire. He'd learned over the years that Duke rarely needed the gun. The dog's sheer size and unwavering presence at the fence line was usually deterrent enough on its own, the same territorial barrier effect Walt had once read about in an extension bulletin, without fully believing it until he watched it work, season after season with his own eyes. He stood beside Duke instead, flashlight steady on the 2 shapes in the brush, and waited. The coyotes held a long moment, testing, and then peeled off one at a time back into the dark, unwilling to press a line a 120-pound dog had made plain he intended to hold. Duke didn't relax right away. He held his position a full 10 minutes after the coyotes were gone, ears still working before he finally straightened, shook himself once, and turned to look at Walt with an expression Walt had long since stopped pretending wasn't something close to satisfaction. "Good boy," Walt said it, quiet, the way he always did, never making a show of it. Duke leaned his full weight into Walt's leg a moment, the closest thing to an embrace an animal that size could offer a standing man, and then turned and walked the fence line once more, slow, checking, before finally settling back down near the flock. Walt stood there a while longer than he needed to, watching his own breath fog in the cold, thinking about the half-second longer it had taken Duke, this time, to straighten back up from that low, braced stance, a thing Walt noticed and didn't say out loud not that night. Not for a while yet. The Coyotes came back 2 more times that same week, testing different stretches of the same fence line, and both times Duke held them off the same way. Presence, not violence. A dog simply refusing to let the line be crossed rather than needing to fight to prove it. But the third night, something was different, and Walt noticed it before he fully understood what he was noticing. Duke's bark came later than usual, not immediately at the first sound of movement in the brush the way it always had before, but a beat or two behind, as though something in the dog's own reflexes had slowed just enough to matter. And when Walt reached the fence line this time, Duke wasn't already braced and holding. He was still getting there, moving with a stiffness in his back legs that Walt had seen building for months but had never quite let himself name directly. The Coyotes tested longer that night before finally backing off, and Walt stood at the fence afterward with his flashlight beam on Duke's slow, careful walk back from the corner post and felt something settle in his chest that had nothing to do with the cold. It was the same specific cold weight he'd carried since March 4 years back, the particular dread of watching something you love change shape in front of you, slower this time than it had been with Carol, but no less certain about where it was headed. He drove into Coleman the next morning and sat in the waiting room of the only large animal vet in that stretch of the county, a careful, unhurried woman named Dr. Renata Solis, who'd been treating Walt's flock, and Duke alongside them, for close to a decade. His hips, Walt. Dr. Solis ran her hands along Duke's back legs with the same slow, thorough care she gave every animal she examined, feeling for the specific give and resistance only a trained hand could read. This is fairly advanced hip dysplasia, and honestly, given his size and his age, I'm a little surprised he's held up as well as he has this long. Big dogs like this, working dogs especially, they carry a lot of wear in those joints over a working lifetime, and 11 years of nights out in weather like this, holding ground against predators, that's real, sustained physical work, Walt, every single one of those nights, whether you were watching or not. Can you fix it? I can manage it. Anti-inflammatories, joint supplements, keeping his weight down, maybe some physical therapy exercises I can walk you through. Dr. Solis looked at Walt directly, the particular gentle bluntness of someone who delivered this exact conversation to enough ranchers over enough years to know there wasn't a kind way to soften it further. What I can't do is make him 11 years old in a working dog's body that's been doing this exact job every single night for over a decade into something younger than that. He's going to have good nights and hard nights from here forward, and the hard nights are only going to become more frequent, not less. I think you already know that, or you wouldn't be sitting here. Walt sat with that a long moment, one hand resting on Duke's broad head, the dog leaning into the touch the same unhurried way he always did. How much longer's he got in him? Working, I mean, not just living. Could be another year of real capable guarding. Could be considerably less if a hard winter or a bad fall sets him back, the way it sometimes does with dogs his size. I wish I had a cleaner answer for you, Walt. I don't. Walt drove home with that answer sitting heavy beside him the whole way, and found himself that evening sitting on the porch step longer than he needed to before going in to make supper, watching Duke walk his usual evening pen round at a pace that already looked, to Walt's newly sharpened eye, a shade slower than it had a month before. "Not going to catch me flat-footed this time," he said out loud, to nobody but the dog and the empty pasture beyond him. "Not going to let this one slip past me the way the last one did." Have you ever had to watch something you'd counted on your whole life start to slow down, and known, plain as weather, coming that you couldn't do a single thing to stop the season from turning the way it was going to turn regardless? I think anyone who's ever loved a working animal or watched a parent age, or simply lived long enough themselves to feel their own bodies start keeping a different pace than it once did, knows exactly the particular quiet weight Walt carried out of that vet's office that morning. Walt didn't say much to anyone about it, in the way of a man who'd spent 30 years mostly keeping his own counsel on the ranch. But his daughter Ellen, 38, living in Abilene, an hour and a half away, close enough to visit most Sundays, but far enough that she'd built her own life separate from the ranch she'd grown up on, noticed something different in her father's voice the next time he called. "You're worried about Duke." "I'm not worried exactly. I'm being realistic. Different thing." "Dad?" Ellen's voice carried the particular patience of a daughter who'd learned over her own 38 years exactly how to get her father to say the actual thing underneath whatever careful thing he'd led with. "You've had that dog 11 years. He was still a puppy the last time I helped you and Mom build that first real sheep pen the summer before I left for college. I remember him falling asleep in the wheelbarrow because he was too little to keep up with the work yet." Walt was quiet a moment. "He's not falling asleep in any wheelbarrow anymore, Ellen. He's out there every single night, still, holding a line against coyotes that would take half my flock in a season if he ever stopped. I don't know what this operation looks like once he can't do that work anymore. I genuinely don't." There was a longer pause on the line than the conversation strictly called for, and when Walt spoke again, something in his voice had shifted, quieter, less careful than usual. "I keep thinking about your mother, Ellen. How fast it went with her. No warning at all, not one single thing I could have done differently even if I'd known to look for it. I've spent 4 years telling myself I'd never be caught flat like that again by something I loved. And here I am watching the same thing happen with Duke. Slower this time, plenty of warning this time, and I still don't know if I'm actually doing anything different about it or just watching it happen the same helpless way, only spread out over a longer stretch of calendar." Ellen was quiet a moment herself, taking that in. "Dad, I don't think this is the same thing. You've got time with Duke that you didn't have with Mom. That's not nothing. That's actually the whole difference." "Time to do what with, though? That's the part I haven't worked out yet. You think about getting a second dog? A younger one, working alongside him while he's still capable, so there's somebody ready to take over when the day comes he can't." Walt hadn't said it out loud to anyone yet, though the thought had been circling the back of his mind for weeks already. "Feels like giving up on him a little, bringing in a replacement while he's still standing that fence line every night." "Or it's the opposite of giving up on him, Dad. It's making sure everything he spent 11 years building here doesn't just end the day his hips finally give out for good." Ellen was quiet a moment herself, taking that in. "I think Mom would have told you the same thing if she were still here to say it plain the way she always did. She's the one who taught you patience with him in the first place, wasn't she? Sounds like maybe it's time to use some of that same patience on getting this part right, too, instead of just standing there watching it happen to you." Walt didn't have a ready answer for that, and didn't try to find one right away. But something in what Ellen said stayed with him longer than most conversations did, turning over in his mind the whole drive back out to the ranch. And by the time he pulled up the driveway, he'd already half decided what he was going to do about it. He drove out to a breeder 2 counties over the following week, a woman named Pat Dunlap, who'd been raising working Great Pyrenees for over 20 years, mostly for exactly the kind of small family operations Walt ran, and came home with an 8-week-old male pup, pale gold and white, clumsy on legs still too big for the rest of him, who Walt named Cooper before he'd even gotten the truck back up the drive. Duke's first reaction to the puppy that same afternoon told Walt everything he needed to know about whether he'd made the right call. The old dog approached slow, the way he approached anything new around the flock, sniffed Cooper thoroughly, unhurried, and then simply lay down beside him in the yard, patient, letting the pup climb over his front legs and chew experimentally at one ear without so much as a flinch. "That's about the gentlest I've ever seen a working guardian dog be with anything," Dr. Solis said, out for a routine check a few days later, watching the two of them together. "Some working LGDs, especially ones this territorial about their own flock, don't take kindly to a second dog moving in on what they consider their job. Duke's not showing one bit of that. If anything, he looks like he's already decided this pup's his to look after too." That turned out to be exactly right, and over the following months, Walt watched something unfold he hadn't fully anticipated when he'd brought Cooper home mostly out of practical necessity. Duke began deliberately and patiently teaching the pup everything Walt himself had never explicitly taught Duke. The evening pen walking, unhurried and calm, Cooper trailing awkwardly at first and then with growing confidence at Duke's shoulder. The particular stillness of holding a fence line rather than charging it. The low warning bark that meant something real was testing the perimeter, distinct from the passing deer bark that meant nothing at all. Walt found himself, some evenings, sitting on the porch step watching the two of them work together and thinking of Carol sitting up with Duke himself on that kitchen floor 11 years back, patient with a crying puppy who'd eventually just figure it out on his own. It struck him, more than once that spring, that he was watching the same patience Carol had first shown Duke now passing forward a second time, dog to dog this time instead of person to dog. The same unhurried care simply finding a new shape to travel in. By early spring, Cooper was accompanying Duke on the evening pen walk most nights, still more enthusiasm than skill, still prone to occasionally chasing a goat simply for the joy of chasing rather than any real herding purpose, but learning, visibly, week over week, the same unhurried rhythm Duke had brought to that same job for 11 years running. Duke, for his part, seemed to Walt to move a little easier that spring than he had the previous fall. Not fully recovered, the hip dysplasia wasn't the kind of thing that reversed itself, but steadier, somehow, in a way Walt couldn't fully explain except to notice it and be grateful for it. I think having a job to teach gave him something to work toward besides just holding on, Walt told Ellen on the phone that spring, and found, saying it out loud, that he believed it. Maybe that's the whole difference between watching something end and watching something get passed along proper. I never got the second one with your mother. Glad I'm getting the chance at it with him. The real test came that same June in a hard, dry stretch that pushed predator activity harder than usual across the whole county. Coyotes, and for the first time in Walt's memory on this particular property, what Dr. Solis confirmed from tracks and a partial trail camera image was very likely a single bobcat working the tree line at the property's southern edge where the fence ran closest to a dry creek bed. The bobcat came at the flock on a hot, still night in the second week of June, and Walt woke not to Duke's usual bark, but to something he'd never heard from the old dog before. A sound closer to a roar than a bark, sustained, furious, coming from the southern fence line rather than Duke's usual northeast post. Walt was out the door in seconds, shotgun in hand this time, genuinely uncertain what he was about to find. What he found in the wash of his flashlight beam was Duke planted directly between the flock and a gap in the fence line where a fallen tree limb had knocked two rails loose sometime that same day, a gap Walt hadn't yet had time to repair, with a full-grown bobcat crouched low on the far side of it, weighing in the frozen moment before it finally broke and ran, whether the size and fury of the dog blocking its way was worth testing further. It wasn't. The bobcat turned and vanished back into the dry creek bed brush, and Duke held his position a long, long while afterward, chest heaving, before he finally allowed himself to sit. It was only then that Walt saw the blood, a shallow but real gash along Duke's left shoulder where the bobcat had gotten one solid swipe in before deciding the fight wasn't worth finishing. "Easy, boy. Easy now." Walt kneeled beside him, checking the wound with careful hands, relief and fear tangled together in a way he hadn't felt since Carol's last hard year. "You held the whole line yourself, whole line and a hole in the fence besides." Cooper, 9 months old that June, still young enough that Walt hadn't fully trusted him alone on guard duty yet, arrived at a dead run from wherever he'd been sleeping, circling Duke twice agitated, before finally settling at the older dog's side, pressed close, as though standing guard over the guardian himself. Walt sat there in the dark a long while after, one hand on each dog, feeling his own heart still going hard in his chest, and understood, plain and sudden, exactly how close this particular night had come to being the other kind of ending, the fast, unwarned kind. The kind he'd already lost Carol to once and had spent 4 years quietly dreading a second time. It hadn't happened that way tonight. but it could have, easily, and Walt sat with that knowledge a long while before he trusted his own legs enough to stand and walk both dogs back toward the house. Dr. Solis came out first thing the next morning, cleaned and stitched the shoulder wound properly, and gave Walt the same careful, honest assessment she always gave. "He's going to heal fine physically. The wound itself isn't deep enough to worry me long term." She packed her kids slowly, choosing her next words with real care. "But I want to say something plain to you, Walt, because I think you already half know it yourself. A dog Duke's age, with hips already compromised the way his are, taking on a full-grown bobcat alone at a fence breach, that's exactly the kind of night that can end very differently than this one did. He got lucky and he got brave, both at once. And I don't say that lightly about an animal who's earned every bit of the respect you've clearly always given him. But I don't know how many more nights like that he's actually got left in him to survive." Walt looked over at where Duke lay, resting in the shade of the barn, Cooper curled tight against his side, both dogs breathing slow and steady in the morning heat. "I know it," Walt said quietly. "Been knowing it since October, if I'm honest with myself about it. Been knowing it a good deal longer than that if I want to be honest about the whole shape of it." Walt made a decision that same week that he'd been circling for months without quite committing to. Duke's working nights from here forward would end, not abruptly, not in a way that stripped the old dog of purpose overnight, but gradually, deliberately, the same patient way Duke himself had taught Cooper everything he knew. Duke still walked the evening pen rounds that whole summer, slower now, Cooper matching his pace rather than racing ahead, the two of them working the flock in together the way they'd practiced all spring. But the night guarding, the actual holding of the fence line against whatever came testing it in the dark, shifted gradually onto Cooper's, still young but rapidly maturing shoulders, with Duke sleeping now in the barn instead of out at the fence line, close enough to hear if something serious happened, far enough that the actual physical burden of the work no longer fell on hips that had already given more than anyone could reasonably have asked of them. It wasn't an easy transition, and Walt didn't pretend otherwise to anyone who asked. There were nights that first month Duke clearly wanted to be out at that fence line, pacing restlessly near the barn door, some deep working instinct in him unwilling to fully accept that the job had passed to someone else. Walt sat with him some of those nights, one hand on the old dog's broad head, saying nothing in particular, simply staying present the way Duke himself had always stayed present for every animal in his care. And staying present, too, Walt understood now, the way he wished someone, anyone, could have simply sat with him through those first raw months after Carol, when there hadn't been any warning at all, and no gradual transition to soften the shape of it. "Wasn't given the chance to sit with your mother slow the way I'm getting to sit with you," Walt told Duke one of those restless nights. "Quiet, the barn dark and warm around them. Figure the least I can do is not waste the chance now that I've got it." By that fall, a full year after the Coyotes first tested that October fence line, Cooper held his own first real confrontation alone. A single coyote testing the same northeast corner Duke had held so many times before, and Cooper, not yet 2 years old, planted himself at that exact post and held the line the way he'd watched his own guardian do it, over and over for a full year of patient teaching. Walt watched it happen from the porch, flashlight beams steady on the young dog's braced stance, and felt something that was equal parts pride and grief. The particular mixture that comes from watching something you love hand its purpose forward to something you love just as much, one generation of working instinct passing directly into the next. He thought, standing there, of Carol writing down the breeder's number on that scrap of paper all those years back, insisting they raise the help properly instead of waiting until they needed it desperately. She'd been right about that, the same way she'd been right about most things Walt had needed longer than her to come around to. He wished, standing on that porch, that he could tell her so directly, one more time, the way he hadn't gotten the chance to tell her anything at all that last ordinary Tuesday in March. Duke lived another 2 full years after that, Gentler years, spent mostly near the house and barn rather than out at the fence line, though he never fully stopped checking the flock each evening, walking the pen rounds alongside Cooper at whatever pace his hips allowed, teaching, right up until the very end, by simple patient presence rather than active guarding. He died peacefully that second winter, in his sleep, in a soft bed Walt had built for him near the wood stove, 13 years old. The particular kind of ending Walt had come, slowly, to understand as its own form of grace, not lost to a bobcat's claw in the dark, not worn down mid-duty on some hard, cold night, but simply, quietly, finished with a job he'd done as completely and as faithfully as any working animal Walt had ever known. Passed cleanly on to a dog he'd raised himself by patient example to carry it forward. Walt buried him near the northeast fence post, the same spot he'd held that first hard October night against the Coyotes. With a simple wooden marker Ellen helped him carve that read only, "Duke, he held the line." He stood at that marker a long while the evening they finished it, Ellen beside him, both of them quiet in the last of the light. "Gotta say goodbye to this one properly," Walt said, not quite looking at his daughter when he said it. "Didn't get the chance with your mother. Don't know that I'll ever fully stop feeling the weight of that particular difference. But I got it right with him at least. Took the warning serious, instead of just standing there watching the season turn on me a second time without doing a single thing about it." Ellen put her hand over her father's on the top rail of the fence, the same unhurried gesture Carol might once have made herself. "I think that's the whole of what any of us actually get to do, Dad. Take the warning serious when we're lucky enough to get any at all. You did right by him. I think you did right by Mom, too, in your own way, even if it didn't feel like there was time enough to prove it back then." Cooper, 5 years old now and fully grown into the job himself, still walks that same evening pen route every night, still holds that same northeast corner when something comes testing the fence in the dark, and some nights, Walt swears, though he's never once said it out loud to anyone but Ellen, Cooper pauses a long moment right at that same post before he settles into position, the same unhurried, deliberate stillness Duke always carried, as though some part of the old dog's own patient watchfulness had simply been handed forward, whole and complete, the same way everything else Duke ever taught him had been. This is farm lore, where we tell the kind of stories the land doesn't let go of easy. If a story like this one stayed with you, if you've ever loved a dog, a horse, any working animal who gave you more than you ever thought to ask for, I'd ask you to do one thing before you go. Hit that subscribe button. There's more of this kind of story waiting, and I'd genuinely love for you to be here when the next one comes. Duke never once left that gate unwatched in 11 years of standing it, night after night, through every kind of weather this country ever threw at him. And even now, buried quiet beneath the same post he held that first hard October, some part of him never really has.